In June 2022, the topic of the Pathwork Steps meetings was a document called Stages of Commitment, which is numbered or filed as AM6 or AD6 for additional materials, number 6. And the document has a little history to it, or it invites a little bit of explanation about the system of the documentation and about the Pathwork community that it was very specifically created for. So Stages of Commitment was not like the regular series of lectures. Stages of Commitment was presented to a specific community at a specific time period for a specific reason. And so it's easy to take a document like that and feel that it's out of date and it doesn't relate to what we need today. I find that Stages of Commitment is still enormously valuable. Many Pathwork communities do. However, it needs a little work to make it relevant for the current situation rather than what it was designed for. So I'm going to go into a bit of history about Pathwork, about these documents, and then discuss the actual stages of commitment. Eva Parakas moved to the United States from Austria. She visited several times in the 30s, but she emigrated in 1938, fleeing the German occupation. And she was a trained dancer. She was a therapist. She was educated. She came from a family who got involved with, I want to say, intellectual or psychological, or she wasn't just a person off the street. She had professional interests in the areas that she wound up being involved with. Sometime around 1951, Eva had an experience that she describes in somewhat vague terms in writing that led her to believe that there was a possibility of doing some mediumship work. It felt like communication outside or from the spirit, world of spirit. So she didn't use those words. She wrote about this experience and what she did with it as part of a preface to a book she later started called Path to the Real Self. And the preface to the Path to the Real Self is where I'm going to give some information about. And it's on my website, it can be downloaded. And it's a fascinating view of Eva Parakas as a person. At the time, she was Eva Brauch, that was her maiden name. And like I say, she had an experience. And she decided that there was a possibility of enlarging the experience, of being able to do something with this spiritual experience. And so she worked with a coach, with a friend coach. I do not know the details of this. And she worked on this for 5 years. That has great meaning for me. When I read the preface, I was very impressed that you would have an experience and decide that there was some potential to it, and then spend 5 years training to enlarge the experience and get a handle on it and understand it, working every day, almost every day, and for many years not making a lot of headway. It strikes me that this is an enormous commitment that she made. So when people see the final result that she was able to transmit the guide and be a medium, they might think, oh, I'd like to do that. Well, that may be what it takes, is 5 solid years of trying to access and gain more understanding of such a possibility, such an experience. So in her preface, she writes that she worked on this for 5 years. And there were various points where she thought she was making some progress, but she did not make significant progress until the end of that 5-year period. At that point, she felt that she had the ability to go into trance and access a voice. She said there were several possibilities, several energies, and that she selected this particular voice to focus on, to deepen her understanding of it. And she was able at the end of 5 years to go into trance and to allow this energy to do automatic writing. So she would go into trance and writing would happen. And then she would come out of trance, and then she, as an individual, as Ava, would read it. Around 1956, this shifted, and she began to be able to go into trance and speak with the voice of this entity. Now, early in my training, early in my Pathwork career, I had not experienced channeling before. I didn't know what it was. And one of my teachers told me to not get too hung up on how the words were received, to pay attention to the words. If the words had meaning, to not be challenged by where they came from. There are people who think that channeling is just a matter of calling on the deepest part of ourselves. And that may be true. In Ava's case in particular, and specifically, the voice that she called forward was able to speak a total of 258 formal lectures and 100 more sessions that I'll explain in a moment, with no notes. These presentations are challenging to read, much less speak. And she did this for 24 years. So if this was coming out of Ava, it was pretty good. Ava was impressive. She claims it was not. She claims that that was not her conscious mind. And it is interesting to read the preface that she wrote and compare it to the writing of the entity that we wound up calling the guide, because it was nice to have a noun or a name to go with it. To read the writings of Ava Paracas and then to read the writings of the guide, and to feel the differences in the voice, in the energy of the two. So in 1956, she began orally presenting this energy. Like I say, she would go into trance. She would give the presentation between an hour and 2 hours. And then she would withdraw, go out of trance. And what she said was then she had to listen to the tape recording or read the transcript, because she was not fully conscious, fully aware of every word that was said. She had a vague sense of what was said. She said one of the phrases she used in her writings is that it was like being in the very, very back of a large room and being able to get some idea of what somebody was speaking, but not the whole thing. So to some extent, Ava Paracas was a student of Pathwork, just like I was, or the rest of us were. She had to read it, listen to it, and work with the material. That was her conscious experience. It is interesting to hear these oral presentations. We still have some of the tapes, and they have been converted into digital form and are available for purchase on pathwork.org. She had an Austrian accent, which you might not be expecting. And her voice was, it sounds to me like it was high and a little strained, as if there was some effort involved. Just trying to organize my facts here to present this. So she began channeling, and they would record and transcribe. The first 10 or 12 lectures were actually in German, in her native language, and then she began to present in English. So they were not only transcribed, they were then translated. And then she began channeling in English. The format was that she would have a meeting and she would present a topic or a lecture. And then 2 weeks later, there would be an opportunity for people to ask questions. So you'd have a lecture and a Q&A session. And sometimes the Q&A session would focus on a particular topic or go a bit afield. And when she reviewed it, she would give it a name so that it looks like there are different lectures by topic, when the initial part of it was an intention to be a Q&A session. So if you read through the lectures, you'll notice in some of them there are way more questions than in others. When I said there were 258 lectures and 100 others, at some point they stopped numbering the Q&A sessions that were not focused on a particular topic. So imagine, if you would, that somebody's got a question and they don't get around to it for a few months, a few weeks or months because of the questions. By the time they ask, that topic's long gone, but they still got their question. So Q&A sessions can be far-ranging and aren't as immediately valuable as the presentation on a particular topic, or when the questions generated the guide speaking on a particular topic. So we'll talk for a moment about the phrase, the guide. I found it absolutely fascinating for personal reasons. I was researching the first 30-odd lectures, and I discovered that at one point in the early 20 numbering system, the guide said that he was actually only a spokesperson for a team of spirits that wanted to present something to humanity, who wanted to help. And so at that juncture, the reason he mentioned it is they were going to change course, they were going to change direction a bit. So the first 20-odd lectures are focused on cosmic stuff, how the world was created, what it's all about, what we're doing here, how we come and go, a general understanding of the intersections of earth and spirit. And then between 20 and 25, the guide would make comments. And basically at one point he said, we have decided to go in a different direction for a while. That there seemed to be a need to focus more on the psychology of being a human being, how it works. And so the tone shifted in the lectures, and it became more about human psychology and human experience and childhood and how we get raised and how our defenses develop. And this was the next 100-odd lectures or so. So at this point, so that's kind of to give you an idea of what we understood the guide to mean, how this may have worked, where there was a team of people with ideas and something to present, and then one person formulated it and moved it through the human being known as Ava, by, in effect, taking the place of her consciousness for a period of time. So she worked on this until 56. In 56, she began presenting, and then she presented, except for summer vacations and a few weeks over the winter. She would present this over a period of 24 years. Now, Ava came down with cancer twice. I do not know the dates of the first incident. I do know that she died from the second. And she died in 1979. And to our knowledge, we have not read or heard of anyone who is channeling this same energy. where you can read something they've done and say, ah, that's the guide just speaking through another person. So that's the pathwork, that's the body of work. And the reason I am trying to give some history here is I want to give some context on where AD6 came in, where stages of commitment came, and using logic and the facts of the community and how it was going at that moment to explain why it's phrased in certain ways. So in the late 60s, Eva Brauch met John Brockes, who had developed bioenergetics with Alexander Lowen. And John thought something was missing from his work, a spiritual entity, a spiritual quality. And when he met Eva and heard the lectures, he felt that was it. And they were married in a matter of a few years. So that was late 60s, starting in 67. By 1972, Eva had been doing all of this work out of her home in New York that she owned. And in 1972, she sold her home in Manhattan and purchased a 100-acre parcel in upstate New York. Closest town was Phonecia, and it's relatively close to Woodstock, the famous festival in the 60s. And it became the Phonecia Pathwork Center. So that's 1972 when that happened. At that point, she had a large number of people who would attend the meetings. They were attending the meetings, they were in study groups. She was training people to be teachers. She had learned to be a teacher, and she was the leader of this large, energetic, growing community of people studying the Pathwork lectures. And they moved a lot of that energy into the Phonecia Pathwork Center. They began holding retreats. They began building classrooms and community centers and building up the land and creating a real retreat for them. So that there were people who worked there, people who were volunteers, people who would come up for the weekend, sometimes every single weekend, people who lived there and studied. In between the weekend retreats, they would study during the week with people. It was quite a vibrant and large community of people. So that by 1978, when AD6 was presented, we had a very large community of varying levels of commitment and purpose and tasks and interests. And because Eva died the following year, I simply believe that the guide had some inkling that this was possible, if it wasn't going to absolutely happen, that it was possible. And that AD6 was delivered in part to help the Pathwork community create some structure, because they may not have realized it, but their leader, the person who had led them for 24 years, would no longer be there in a year. And I can see where more structure would have helped the community get through this horrendous grieving period and the restructuring and finding new leadership and finding their own way. And so that's how I present it with my understanding. I was not there. So now we'll go to AD6. So the stages of commitment is a lengthy document, and it addresses commitments that are suggested, strongly suggested, for varying levels of Pathwork personnel and leadership. There's even a section of commitments that even employees should make. Now, for some people that seems quite odd, but to some extent, think of it like a church or any organization that's dedicated to a certain philosophy. You want your employees to be on board. You don't want them to be antagonistic to the purpose of all these meetings and all these events and the cooking and the cleaning and the building. So there's even a section on commitments for employees, for staff only, people who aren't necessarily taking classes or being a part of the weekend retreat work or wanting to be students or teachers, but who are involved with the community on a regular basis, also including volunteers who may come up. So as you can see, there was a stratification that wasn't well identified sometimes, perhaps, in terms of where are you in relation to the Pathwork lectures? Where are you in relation to the philosophy, to the attitudes, to the goals of the organization? So besides the staff and employee commitments that were suggested, now I'm going to move to the main body of AD6, which was to codify 4 different stages of commitment to Pathwork. Now, the document itself is long and it goes into a lot of explanation and has these other commitments involved. What I and a lot of other organizations do is we, at some point, you just want to know what are the questions, what are the stages. And so I boil it down to a 2-page document that's on my website. It's just the questions. And I even made a little PDF that will download and you can staple it in the middle. So you can have a booklet, foldable booklet of what the questions are. For me, it's for reference. When somebody asks a question, I've got something it's easier for me to find what they're talking about. So that's what I'm going to speak about now, is the actual stages of commitment. A lot of the text in AD6 is about saying, this is not a yes or no thing. This is not a do you or don't you document. The goal is for people to consider their commitment. And if these statements do not reflect where you are, to rewrite them, to add to them, to express where you're strong or weak in that particular commitment. So the invitation was for people to look at the commitments and to take various stages at various times, but not simply a matter of ticking a box or saying yes or no, but to consider what their commitment is and to take a stage. And what they did for that particular community was it allowed you to know where everybody was. Now, for instance, stage 1 was suggested for anyone, and the phrase was entering the path. Now, I don't know what that means. It sounds like it means entering a formal program of any extended length. Surely people could attend the lectures or presentations. They might be able to come up for a weekend, do a workshop. But the phrase was, those entering the path were expected to, at minimum, take a stage 1 commitment. So I'm going to introduce the 4 different stages, one at a time, with that kind of explanation. Stage 1 was the starting point. That's where you said, I'm ready to sign up for whatever. So the questions in stage 1, and I emphasize to people when they take a look at this, is they're used to organizations that want you to sign up or promise or there's a little coercion or manipulation into doing it our way. But in this document, the guide in AD6, the guide says over and over again, you need to make these yours. But what I find is that people react to making commitments. And so what I do to coach them along is to say, look at the verbs. Read the verbs, underline the verbs. So in my copy of the booklet, I underline the verbs so I can emphasize to people. And I'll give you some samples. So in stage 1, the first question is, are you fully aware that the pathwork is a spiritual path and not an individual therapy? So focusing on, are you aware? It does not mean that you give up individual therapy. It does not mean that you wholeheartedly engage in a path that you may not fully understand yet. The question is, are you aware? That this is not about making you feel better or fixing your problems. That this is a spiritual pursuit, a spiritual community has bigger goals. Are you aware? So the answer might be, I'm aware and I'm not quite sure what the path is. That's a yes to that question. So what I'm emphasizing is the question is about becoming more conscious of what you understand. And when you do this in a public situation, when you are in a meeting and you stand up and take a stage 1 commitment, you are explaining to others where you are, what your understanding is. And that fosters understanding, cooperation, and communication within the community. Question 2 includes the phrase, are you willing to allow for some facts? Are you willing to allow for some facts? Question 4 starts with, do you commit yourself to allow? And question 5 includes, are you willing to understand the dynamics between, and it goes on. Are you willing to understand the dynamics? In effect, if the question goes on, it says, if you feel threatened by the process of removing a fixed prejudice. So if I believe that something is wrong, and Pathwork says it's not wrong, just to be simplistic, am I willing to am I willing to understand the dynamics behind my point of view? Why do I think it's wrong? Why am I invested in right and wrong? Why must I segregate things over there saying that's wrong? And what are the dynamics of my fixed prejudice? Am I willing to understand the dynamics? And that's the gist of stage 1. Most communities have gotten out of the practice of demanding that people commit before they start a program. And I agree with that. I think one needs a little bit more understanding. Just because you say you don't have to commit, and then you ask me for some questions publicly in front of people. We have all had the experience of being coerced a little bit. So it is useful to have this stage come after you've gotten some education about Pathwork and how it actually looks, what it does, what happens in those communities, what happens in those retreats. Basically, do we walk the talk, or the words not reflect how the Pathwork community behaves? So it feels like there needs to be a level of trust involved before you ask someone to make a commitment. Stage 2 is a little heavier. It asks that we engage more fully with other community members. Stage 2 was recommended for those who wanted to take on leadership roles, members of the board of directors, people who supervise. There's a wide range of people that might meet that requirement. If you're going to engage with putting forward policies and engaging in administration of this Pathwork community, you should have some deeper understanding of what's this all about. So stage 2, number 1 asks, did you make stage 1? Are you there? Did you commit to stage 1? Because this doesn't stand alone. Question 2 says, are you willing to carry an awareness with you? In other words, you've learned all this stuff. Are you willing to carry an awareness with you into your daily life, into the work that you're doing? So we don't want, the emphasis was to not separate things into, we do this in a Pathwork community, and then I do what I want in my spare time. Philosophically, morally, that's a separation. The idea is that that's why it's a spiritual community and not what you do when you're here and then you do whatever you want when you go home. Question 3 involves, are you willing to consult your innermost self when you have a struggle with community members, with a principal? Are you willing to consult your innermost self? It's still asking the question, are you willing? Are you open to growth? Are you open to change? And the truth is, sometimes we're not. It is my experience that Pathwork accepted people who said, I'm not sure. Or, well, I've been in the past, it's getting a little harder as we go deeper into the material. The question is not absolute. It's about, are you willing? Question 4 is about how you interact with community members, whether you're willing to basically tell the truth as you see it, when people aren't necessarily happy to hear your point of view. And the phrase that I underline is, are you willing to chance their anger with you? Are you willing to engage in some level of controversy? Or are you just looking for everybody to get along? The fifth question is the toughest, and it's about collusion. That's a whole other topic, and so I'm not going to go too deeply into this. But the idea is that collusion is when we talk about somebody on the side because it makes us feel better and we have some negative fun. And then we don't take it any further. We don't clean it up. And so question 5 says, are you willing to forswear all kinds of collusion, active and passive? So I want to focus on that word, forswear, because what I do when the guide has a lot of antique phrases in the Pathwork. It's a high level vocabulary that the guide's using. So I looked up forswear, and forswear means to decide or declare to not engage in or with. To decide or declare not to engage, which could look as simple as people are having a gossip session about a teacher and they're just complaining, they're just blowing off steam. And you do not engage with that activity. Now it goes a step further and encourages you to say, if that's a problem, let's talk about it. Let's take it to the teacher and talk about it. In my community of origin, I found that there was a distortion that happened to this particular stage of commitment to that particular question. And the distortion was that people were so afraid of having to take it to the person they were gossiping or speaking negatively of, that they wouldn't talk about them in the first place. But I invite you to see where that's not necessarily being clean about it. To avoid the issue is not to deal with the issue. So because people are afraid of this commitment, that if they have a problem, that they would then at some point take it to the authority figure or the other person and work things out. They simply didn't discuss the problem. And so things didn't get dealt with because people were afraid of completing the task of bringing things up. So I emphasize in this question, do you forswear? Do you make a decision not to engage? And then how do you enact the decision? doesn't say don't do it. It doesn't say never do it. It's talking about a declaration that you would make as a part of stage 2 to a community of people about your intentions. So that's stage 2. Stage 3 is for people who are considering going into teaching or helpership. Now, various communities around the world have some partial teaching. It's not fair, partial teaching. They will have stages of teacher training so that some people complete the entire process and some people complete a part of it, and they're allowed to teach on lower levels, lecture study class, help out where they can. So there are various levels, but each of them would need to take a look at stage 3. And the key phrase is, there's only 3 questions in stage 3. One is, are you willing to make this commitment? It's an invitation in that moment, even if you thought you were, it's an invitation in that moment to realize, no, I'm not. And in Pathwork, that's a victory. The idea is to realize where you are, what you want, what you think and feel, not to erase it, get rid of it, or move on. So the discovery of what you believe is what we're after. And if that means that you stand up to take a 3rd stage commitment and you change your mind, that's a victory. You've learned something. Work on it, come back when you're ready. It's not a failure, and it's certainly not it's not intended to be a barrier to the work you'd like to do. The second question is, are you willing to further your study and practice of Pathwork teachings? In other words, you're not done. Are you willing to go further? It's a commitment to continue. And the third question is, are you prepared to want to, not have to, contribute? But it doesn't say you must contribute. It says, are you prepared? So you can be prepared and not do a great job, and you just keep working at it. Again, I invite you to see these as being alive, they're organic. They change moment to moment. But if you can imagine making a commitment in front of your community, saying, I'm prepared to continue studying, it's a motivator for you to do that. It's also nice to know who else is committed versus who is just still thinking about this work and not necessarily willing at that moment to go deeper. Think of it in terms of wedding vows nowadays, where people write their own vows. Or people don't get married, and yet they can have just as strong and dedicated and committed a relationship as people who do. So again, this is intended to support the process rather than be a demand. Now, I want to say stage 4 is a bit of a demand. Stage 4 is required for those who become helpers, who take the title, the formal title, Pathwork Helper. Why? Because that entails far more responsibility than being on a board or helping out after classes, or even teaching a few lectures in a study class. To become a helper is a real commitment to a specific spiritual path and a way of doing things. So there's a lot of questions in stage 4. But for instance, question 2 is, do you cleanse your motives daily? Not weekly, not when you get around to it. You cleanse your motives daily. Does that mean that you, in effect, take a scrub brush and go over every motive you can find? No. It says, do you cleanse your motives? Do you review? Do you look at? Do you consider? And then later in the question, it says these motives may still exist. In other words, you may still have a dirty motive. but you attempt to cleanse it. You attempt to do a little work every single day. Question 2 says, do you consider your pathwork a necessary prerequisite for executing your duty? In other words, do you walk the talk that you are teaching? I'm sure you can imagine how important that would be for someone who says they're committed to a spiritual path, to teaching a spiritual path, but they are actually doing it themselves on a daily basis. Question 4 is, do you commit yourself to become a model and example? Now, whether or not you commit yourself, you're a teacher, you are one. So they're saying you're headed for being a teacher. Are you sure you really got the whole picture here? Are you willing to commit to being a model or an example? Because it's very easy for someone to slam an entire faith or profession or philosophy based on, yeah, but the teachers don't do it. They don't live the words. They do what they want, and they try to teach me to be a better person. And it breeds a lack of respect for the material. So the commitment here is that you're going to back up what you teach with how you live. Question 5 asks you to do your utmost to resolve whatever authority problem you may still have. Notice the words. You're human, you may still have some authority issues, but are you committed to resolving, which is organic? It's a slope. It's a process to resolve authority issues. Question 6, are you willing to be prepared to deal with the possible hostility of others? Negative transference. Anyone in authority knows about negative transference. Put yourself in a position of authority, and people with authority issues are going to start shooting arrows at you. You need to be ready for this. It's realistic. You're just not going to get, you're not going to be the only one in the room that's not targeted when people have authority issues. So it's asking, are you ready? Are you ready to deal with this? And later in the question, it's not so much that to react as human, but to understand the dynamics and work on helping resolving the situation. In question 7, it says, are you fully aware of this responsibility and are you willing to honor it? And that has to do with creating a bond where you offer to help someone. That you don't say the equivalent 3 days later of, oh, never mind, I'm too busy. The bonds you create are spiritual bonds. Don't make them casual. And if you need to address one, address it. Don't ghost that person. And the last one is about giving to your community. This is not a matter of wanting to, this is a matter of, that's your job, to give to your community. Now, again, this was for a group of people who were building, it probably felt like they were building a life together. It was a very large, very rich, very committed, profound community. And many of them would have classmates and teachers living in their city or community when they went home as well. So I like the idea of the commitments, and I like the idea in terms of finding a way to translate these commitments into a life that's not so immersed in spiritual thought process. It's not as committed. So if you personally are committed to Pathwork, it's useful, I believe, to ask such questions. Are you willing? Are you willing to enact the equivalent of a spiritual commitment to sense that you're doing something negative, that you're doing some collusion, some nasty gossiping, and say, we need to clean this up. and to encourage the people you're around and with to move towards a more positive resolution than just negative hammer. Now, you're not going to be able to do as much as you can in a spiritual community, but you can do quite a bit for standing on your own principles. So perhaps you can see where I find AD6 very useful. I found it a great guideline in my journey to being a Pathwork helper. I rely on it. One of the things that is in AD6 that, well, it's in there, but it's not quite spelled out, that I found in my community of origin that I was very impressed with, was one thinks that when you take stage 1 and then stage 2 and then stage 3, and what happens if you can't hold it? And in my community of origin, which was the Pathwork of California, I learned a fabulous lesson from one of the faculty who at some point felt burned out and they needed a sabbatical. They needed to step back from the work they'd done for 10, 15, 20 years. And so during one of our annual commitment ceremonies, they got up with the rest of us, and the system was that everybody who was going to take a stage would get up and we would all take stage 1. And then the people who wanted to stop there would sit down. And then those of us who wanted to go on would take stage 2. And after that, if that's all you wanted to do, you would sit down. Those of us who wanted to take stage 3 would take stage 3. And at that point, the faculty member sat down. She didn't just disappear. She told the truth. I am letting go of my 4th stage commitment. I am stepping down from leadership. I am stepping down from my helpership. And then those who wanted to reconfirm their commitment or make it for the first time completed and said their 4th stage. A year or 2 later, they stood up during an annual commitment ceremony and retook their 4th stage commitment. I found that a powerful demonstration and lesson of responsible leadership. And it also showed me that if you pick something up and it's not working for you, you put it down responsibly, which is what I admire with people in real life, in my regular life, as well as in my community. So what I'm trying to communicate is that if you are interested in taking the commitment, it is not forever. It is for as long as you can hold it. And I think I mentioned marriage vows before. There was a time and place where marriage was so integral to the structure of society that they really couldn't afford you to change your mind. So it was for life. Just you sign up and that's it. No returns, no givebacks. And today we have a growing philosophy that marriage shouldn't be something forced. And if things change, it should be reviewed. And so the phrase enters ceremonies nowadays of as long as love lasts. And I found this experience of seeing a helper and faculty member step back from their 4th stage commitment, take their break, and then when they were ready, stand up and with enthusiasm and commitment and care, take that up again. And it was not a requirement that they do that. So that's how I saw my community walking the talk. It gave me more confidence in making commitments because it wasn't a one-way street. In terms of taking commitments, since I taught this for the month to the people in the meetings, we're going to make some space during August of 2022 for people to make a commitment. But it doesn't have to be a formal thing. It doesn't have to be a specific group. You could, in theory, take this in front of anybody. And you'd say, well, but they don't understand it. Well, they don't have to understand it. You have to understand it. So consider these commitments as first being made to yourself by yourself. And then you might explore sharing your commitments with a friend or an intimate acquaintance or a small group. And there may not be a situation where you're in a wide-ranging community of people who can make space for this particular language. And yet you can still make the kind of commitments that are laid out here. So while the original concept may work best in Pathwork communities where they have frequent meetings a year and they have a commitment ceremony once or twice a year, it's up to us to make the commitment that works for us. It's up to us to find a place to express where we are and what our beliefs are. And that's something that helps me commit month by month, year by year, decade by decade at this point to Pathwork, because I feel that it is organic, it can be real. Go on from there. Anyway, my goal here is to invite you to read Pathwork materials. This is an unusual one, so I thought it needed more explanation and some context about where it came from, so that when the language seems a little fenced in, you would understand that for them, they may have needed more structure than you may need today for encouraging yourself to continue your own spiritual work. I'd also invite anybody to take these and rewrite them for their own purpose in terms of any spiritual practice, because that to me is the value of the Pathwork concept. It can be translated into other arenas of life, even though we don't necessarily use the same terms. So thanks for listening to this. Thanks for considering reading some Pathwork materials. And take good care.